Steven Pinker is a Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary, and one of the world's foremost writers on language, mind, and human nature. His research has won prizes from the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Institution, the American Psychological Association, and the Cognitive Neuroscience Society. He has also received several teaching awards and many prizes for his books, The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, and The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. He has been named Humanist of the Year, Time's 100 Most Influential People in the World Today, and Foreign Policy, World's Top 100 Public Intellectuals. He has written for the New York Times, Time Magazine, The New Republic, The New Yorker, and other publications on consciousness, genomics, morality, war and peace, and of course, language. Ladies and gentlemen, Steven Pinker.
Thank you, Ron. Why is so much writing so bad, and how can we make it better? Why do we have to decipher so much legalese, like the revocation by these regulations of a provision previously revoked subject to savings does not affect the continued operations? Why is it so hard to understand an academic article, like it is the moment of non-construction, disclosing the absentation of actuality from the concept, in part through its invitation to emphasize in reading the helplessness of its fall into conceptuality? Why is it so hard to set the time on a digital alarm clock? Well, there's no shortage of theories, and the most popular theory is captured in this cartoon, where the boss says to the tech writer, "Good start, needs more gibberish." In other words, bad writing is a deliberate choice. Bureaucrats insist on gibberish to evade responsibility. Pasty-faced nerds get their revenge on the girls who turned them down for dates in high school and the jocks who kicked sand in their faces. Pseudo-intellectuals try to bamboozle their readers with highfalutin gobbledygook, concealing the fact that they have nothing to say. Well, I have no doubt that the bamboozlement theory is true of some writers some of the time, but in my experience, it doesn't ring true. I know plenty of scientists and scholars who do groundbreaking work on important topics. They have no need to impress and nothing to say. Still, their writing stinks. Good people can write bad prose. The other theory that is frequently bruited to explain bad writing is that digital media are to blame for ruining the language. I'm sure you've all seen this. Google is making us stupid. The dumbest generation has been stupefied by digital media, and they are jeopardizing our future. Twitter is forcing us to think and write in 140 characters. Well, I think there's some problems with the dumbest generation theory as well, because it makes a prediction that it must have been very different before the advent of digital media. Say, and those of you who were around in the 1980s can surely remember that back then teenagers spoke in fluent paragraphs, bureaucrats wrote in plain English, and every academic article was a masterpiece in the art of the essay. Yes, that's the way it was in the 1980s. Or was it the 1970s? The truth is, of course, that bad writing has burdened readers in every era, such as 1961, in which one commentator wrote, "Recent graduates, including those with university degrees, seem to have no mastery of the language at all." Well, maybe you have to go back before the advent of television and radio, say to 1917, when someone wrote, "From every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate. Every high school is in disrepair because its pupils are so ignorant of the merest rudiments." Well, maybe you have to go back to earlier centuries when literacy was prized. Well, in 1785, they were saying, "Our language is degenerating very fast. I begin to fear that it will be impossible to check it." And then, of course, there are the ancient grammar police, like the commentator who said, "Oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a little birdie." I think a better theory comes from an observation by Charles Darwin that man has an instinctive tendency to speak as we see in the babble of our young children, whereas no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. Speech is instinctive, but writing is and always has been hard. Your readers are unknown, invisible, and inscrutable. They exist only in the writer's imagination. They can't react if something is unclear, break into the conversation, or ask for clarification. So writing is an act of pretense, and writing is an act of craftsmanship. Well, what can we do to improve the craft of writing? For many decades, that question had a single answer. You hand students this, the iconic Elements of Style by Cornell professor William Strunk Jr. and his former student E.B. White, also known as the New Yorker essayist and author of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little. You'll notice, by the way, that the junior member of this pair was born before the turn of the century, that is, before the turn of the 20th century. There's no doubt that there is plenty of good sense in the Elements of Style, and it is well worth consulting. It has pithy little advisories such as use definite, specific, concrete language, write with nouns and verbs, put the emphatic words of the sentence at the end, and in another little gem of self-exemplification, omit needless words, which indeed omits needless words. On the other hand, there are a number of reasons why the Elements of Style can't be the sole basis of writing advice in the 21st century. For one thing, it's filled with a lot of baffling advice, such as the word people is not to be used with words of number in place of persons. That is, you may not say 6 people. Why not? Well, if of 6 people, 5 went away, how many people would be left? Answer, 1 people. Did you follow that? It would also rule out things like, 3 children, 32 teeth. Does not seem to make much sense. How's this? To contact is vague and self-important. Do not contact people. Get in touch with them, look them up, phone them, find them, or meet them. Well, yes, but what if you don't care how one person is going to get in touch with another, and what if it's just as acceptable if they tweet them, instant message them, email them, or any other medium? The basis for this advice was that the verb to contact happened to be a neologism when White was a young man, and so it grated on his ears. In the many decades since then, to contact has become an unexceptionable part of the language, precisely because it serves a need. Namely, sometimes you don't care how one person is going to get in touch with another one unless you do so, so you don't want to specify, phone them, meet them, and so on. Or how about this one? Note that the word clever means one thing when applied to people, another when applied to horses. A clever horse is a good-natured one, not an ingenious one. The problem with traditional style advice is that it consists of an arbitrary list of do's and don'ts based on the tastes and peeves of the authors. It is not based on a principled understanding of how language works, and as a result, users have no way of understanding and assimilating the advice, and much of the advice, as I'll show you, is just plain wrong. I think we can do better today. We could base writing advice on the science and scholarship of language, on modern grammatical theory, which is a marked advance over the traditional Latin-based grammars, evidence-based dictionaries and grammars, research in cognitive science on what makes sentences easy or hard to read, and historical and critical studies of usage. And this is what I've tried to do in The Sense of Style. It begins with a model of effective prose. Now, as I mentioned, writing is an unnatural act. And good style, above all, requires a mental model of the communication scenario. Who is the reader, and what are you as a writer trying to accomplish? My favorite model of the ideal communication scenario comes from a wonderful little book called Clear and Simple as the Truth by the literary scholars Francis-Noël Thomas and Mark Turner, who outline a model of communication they call classic style. The model is that prose is a window onto the world. The writer sees something in the world. The reader has not yet noticed it. The writer positions the reader so that the reader can see it with her own eyes. The writer and reader are equals, just that the writer knows something that the reader has not yet noticed. The goal is to help the reader see an objective reality, and the style is conversation. Well, this all sounds pretty obvious. What is non-classic style? Well, there are many alternatives to classic style. Turner and Thomas describe contemplative style, oracular style, practical style, and a number of others. But the one that academics and other professionals often write in is a style they call postmodern or self-conscious, in which the writer's chief, if unstated, concern is to escape being convicted of philosophical naivete about his own enterprise. They explain, when we open a cookbook, we completely put aside and expect the author to put aside the kind of question that leads to the heart of certain philosophical traditions. Is it possible to talk about cooking? Do eggs really exist? Is food something about which knowledge is possible? Can anyone ever tell us anything true about cooking? Classic style similarly puts aside as inappropriate philosophical questions about its enterprise. If it took these questions up, it could never get around to treating its subject, and its purpose is exclusively to treat its subject. And I believe that, let me, since classic prose is about showing something to the reader, it's only fair that I show you an example of classic prose. So here's an example from an article in Newsweek by the physicist Brian Greene explaining the theory of inflationary cosmology and one of its implications, multiple universes, or the multiverse. Greene writes, if space is now expanding, then at ever earlier times, the universe must have been ever smaller. At some moment in the distant past, everything we now see, the ingredients responsible for every planet, every star, every galaxy, even space itself, must have been compressed to an infinitesimal speck that then swelled outward, evolving into the universe as we know it. The Big Bang theory was born. Yet, scientists were aware that the Big Bang's theory suffered from a significant shortcoming. Of all things, it leaves out the bang. Einstein's equations do a wonderful job of describing how the universe evolved from a split second after the bang, but the equations break down, similar to the error message returned by a calculator when you try to divide 1 by 0, when applied to the extreme environment of the universe's earliest moment. The Big Bang thus provides no insight into what might have powered the bang itself. Now, this covers some pretty sophisticated physics and abstruse mathematics, but Greene presents it in a way that you can see everything for yourself in your mind's eye. If you know that space is expanding, then you can mentally play the movie in reverse and extrapolate back to the singularity at which space was infinitesimally small and imagine it then the movie going forward in return. The abstruse concept of an equation breaking down can be appreciated by the reader either by pulling out a calculator and dividing 1 by 0, and sure enough, your calculator will give you an error message. Or you could even, the reader is welcome to try to imagine what it could possibly mean for 1 to be divided into 0 parts, or some number of parts, each of which was 0. And so the reader can see for herself exactly what Greene is trying to show. I believe that many examples of good writing advice are implications of the model of communication behind classic prose. For example, the focus of good writing should be on the thing being shown, not on the activity of studying it. The following is that is the writer's job, peer group, daily activities, and so on. Now, I am daily faced with reading papers and articles that begin in the following way. In recent years, an increasing number of researchers have turned their attention to the problem of child language acquisition. In this article, recent theories of this process will be reviewed. Well, no offense, but not a whole lot of people are really interested in how professors spend their time. A classic way of introducing an article on the same topic would be, all children acquire the ability to speak and understand a language without explicit lessons. How do they accomplish this feat? A corollary is to minimize the kind of apologizing that suffuses academic prose. Again, this should be all too familiar to those of you who have read academic review articles. The problem of language acquisition is extremely complex. It is difficult to give precise definitions of the concept of language and the concept of acquisition and the concept of children. There is much uncertainty about the interpretation of experimental data and a great deal of controversy surrounding the theories. More research needs to be done. Well, classic prose gives the reader credit for being smart enough to know that many concepts are hard to define and many controversies are hard to resolve. The reader is there to see what the writer is going to do about it. Another corollary of the model behind classic prose is to minimize the kind of hedging that professional writers are apt to indulge in, where they drizzle their prose with mushy little qualifiers, like somewhat, fairly, nearly, seemingly, in part, relatively, comparatively, predominantly, to some extent, so to speak, and presumably. And the similar device of using shutter quotes to imply that they don't really mean what they are saying. I'll give you an example from a letter of recommendation that I received. She is a, quote, quick study and has been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her. Well, are we to understand this as meaning that this young woman is a quick study, or that she is a quick study, namely someone who is kind of rumored or alleged to be a quick study, but maybe isn't? And what is that virtually doing? Is it that there are some areas in which that interest her where she just never bothered to educate herself or was unsuccessful in doing so? The use of hedges has become so reflexive in professionals and academics that at one point I approached a distinguished scientist and I asked her how she was, and she pulled out a picture of her 4-year-old daughter and she said, "We virtually adore her." Aww. Why the compulsive hedging? Well, there is a saying among bureaucrats that you must always follow the imperative CYA, cover your anatomy. And there is an alternative, namely, so sue me. That is, it's often better to be clear and wrong than fuzzy and, as the physicists say, not even wrong. Even when you don't, one can count on the cooperative nature of ordinary conversation to avoid unnecessary hedges. If someone says that they are moving away from Seattle because it's a rainy city, you understand them as saying, not as implying that it rains there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, but just that it is relatively rainy, and she didn't have to actually say Seattle is a relatively rainy city for you to understand it in that way. Another implication of classic prose is that since it is a window, the writer must work to keep up the illusion that the reader is seeing a world rather than just listening to verbiage. And for that reason, it is imperative to, as they say, avoid cliches like the plague. You're all familiar with a kind of writer who dispenses verbiage like this: "We needed to get the ball rolling in our search for the Holy Grail, but found that it was neither a magic bullet nor a slam dunk. So we rolled with the punches and let the chips fall where they may while seeing the glass as half full, which is easier said than done."
Don't they turn a corner?
Pardon me?
Don't they turn a
Oh, of course, they turn a corner, absolutely, yes. At the leading edge, after they found the low-hanging fruit. If you just ladle out one cliche after another, either your reader will simply shut down their visual cortex, or if they keep it awake, they will get derailed by the inevitable mixed metaphors. Like this one from another letter of recommendation: "Jeff is a Renaissance man, drilling down to the core issues and pushing the envelope." Not clear how you can do both at the same time. "No one has yet invented a condom that will knock people's socks off." And you may also be eligible for membership in AWFUL, Americans who figuratively use literally. Now, it's okay to say she literally blushed. It's a little more problematic to say she literally exploded. And it's very, very bad to say she literally emasculated him. Classic prose is about the world, not about the conceptual tools with which we understand the world. And so classic prose avoids meta-concepts, namely concepts about concepts like approach, assumption, concept, condition, context, framework, issue-level model, perspective, process, role, strategy, tendency, variable. And admit it, haven't you seen these words a lot in professional prose? For example, this is from a lawyer, a legal scholar writing in the New York Times. I have serious doubts that trying to amend the Constitution would work on an actual level. On the aspirational level, a constitutional amendment strategy may be more valuable. In other words, I doubt that trying to amend the Constitution would actually succeed, but it may be valuable to aspire to it. Or it's important to approach this subject from a variety of strategies, including mental health assistance, but also from a law enforcement perspective. That is, we need to consult psychiatrists, but we also may have to inform the police. Classic prose narrates ongoing events. We see agents performing actions that affect objects, just as we do when an event unfolds in real life. Non-classic prose tends to thingify events and then refer to them rather than narrating them in real time. And there is a dangerous rule of English grammar that makes this all too easy called nominalization, where you take a perfectly spry verb and you entomb it as a noun. So instead of appearing, someone makes an appearance. Instead of organizing something, you bring about the organization of it. Helen Sword, an English scholar, refers to them as zombie nouns because they kind of lumber across the stage without any conscious agent actually directing their motion. Turgid professional prose is full of nominalizations like prevention of neurogenesis, diminished social avoidance, meaning when we prevented neurogenesis, the mice no longer avoided other mice. Subjects were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation. To wit, we tested the students in a quiet room. Now, the use of meta-concepts and nominalizations almost defines the stereotype of academies in the public imagination. As in this editorial cartoon by Tom Tolles, in which he shows an academician explaining the reason that verbal SAT scores are at an all-time low. Incomplete implementation of strategized programmatics designated to maximize acquisition of awareness and utilization of communication skills pursuant to standardized review and assessment of languaginal development. Any interrogatory verbalizations? It isn't just academics who use meta-concepts and nominalizations. It's also politicians, as when Rick Perry, when the Republican National Convention was threatened by a hurricane, said, right now there is not any anticipation that there will be a cancellation. In other words, right now we don't anticipate that we will have to cancel it. And corporate consultants. A man explained to a reporter what he did for a living. He said, I'm a digital and social media strategist. I deliver programs, products, and strategies to our corporate clients across the spectrum of communications functions. And the reporter kept pressing him as to what that meant. And finally he said, I teach big companies how to use Facebook. And product engineers. Portable generators used to have the warning sticker that said, mild exposure to CO can result in accumulated damage over time. Extreme exposure to CO may rapidly be fatal without producing significant warning symptoms. Yeah. And what began to happen is that every year, several hundred people asphyxiated themselves and their families by running them indoors. And so they changed the sticker to read, using a generator indoors can kill you in minutes. So classic prose is literally a matter of life and death. Yes, literally. Okay, so how does understanding the design of language lead to better writing advice, as I promised at the outset? Well, another contributor to zombie prose is the passive voice, the difference between the dog bit the man in the active voice and the man was bitten by the dog in the passive voice. And it's well known that the passive voice is overused by academics. On the basis of the analysis which was made of the data which were collected, it is suggested that the null hypothesis can be rejected. And by lawyers. If the outstanding balance is prepaid in full, the unearned finance charge will be refunded. And political officials. This is the recently ex-director of the Secret Service who, in explaining to Congress how it was that an armed man managed to vault the fence of the White House, sprint across the lawn, and waltz into the White House, she admitted mistakes were made, what linguists call the evasive passive. And not surprisingly, all the classic style manuals warn writers away from the passive voice. As Strunk and White advised, use the active voice. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. Many a tame sentence can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. Now, do you notice something a little odd about this advice? Yes, it uses the passive voice to advise against the passive voice. George Orwell, in the other classic bit of writing advice that is handed out to every college freshman, also advises against using the passive. He notes that a mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence is the most marked characteristic of modern English prose. I list below various of the tricks by means of which the work of prose construction is habitually dodged. The passive voice is wherever possible used in preference to the active, a bit of advice that has not one, but two passives to warn readers away from the passive. Well, this self-contradiction tells us something. The passive could not have survived in the English language for centuries if it did not serve some purpose. Why can't we do without it? The answer comes down to the very design of language. You can think of language as an app for converting a web of knowledge into a string of words. Now, cognitive psychologists model a person's knowledge as a semantic network, a kind of mind-wide web, where there are nodes that correspond to concepts, and there are connectors or links or relationships that stand for logical and conceptual relationships among them. So this is a tiny and simplified fragment of a semantic network that captures a person's knowledge of the tragic story brought to life by Sophocles in Oedipus Rex. Now, what happens when you have to communicate a bit of your knowledge to another person? Well, you have to convert it into a sentence. What is a sentence? It is a linear string of words, such as in Sophocles' play, Oedipus married his mother and killed his father, one word after another. Well, this linearization of this high-dimensional web means that language is saddled with an inherent problem. The ordering of words in a sentence has to do two things at once. It has to serve as a code for meaning, signaling to the reader who did what to whom, but it also necessarily presents some bits of information to the reader before others, and thus affects how the information is absorbed into the reader's mind. In particular, the earlier material in the sentence naturally pertains to the topic, what the sentence is about, what the reader is, in effect, already looking at. The later material is the focus or focal point of the sentence, and it's what the reader should now notice. Any prose that violates these principles will feel, as we say, choppy or disjointed or incoherent. So this now helps us understand the main function of the passive. It allows writers to convey the same semantic information, namely the same information about who did what to whom, but with a different surface order. That is, it allows the writer to start with the done to rather than with the doer, which is why avoid the passive is bad advice. The passive is the better construction when the done to is currently the focus of the reader's mental gaze. And let me give you an example. This is a passage taken from the Wikipedia entry for Oedipus Rex, which describes the climactic scene in which the awful truth behind the Oedipus story is brought to light. Spoiler alert. And here is how it reads. Narrating this scene. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time he was given a baby. The baby, he says, was given to him by another shepherd from the Laius household, who had been told to get rid of the child. Now, notice that this passage has three passives in a row. First, all eyes are on the messenger. The passage begins, a messenger arrives. So we're looking at the messenger. It's natural then to use the passive and say, he was given a baby. Well, now our attention is focused on the baby. So you start the next sentence with the baby, and that will require that it be in the passive voice. The baby was given to the messenger by another shepherd. Hey, another shepherd. Now we're looking at the other shepherd, so it's natural that the next sentence begins with the shepherd. The other shepherd had been told to get rid of the child. So it's a coherent passage where the anonymous writer has kept in mind where the reader's mental gaze is directed at every stage. Now imagine that he had followed the advice to convert the passives to the active voice. The passage would have read as follows. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time, someone gave him a baby. Another shepherd from the Laius household, he says, whom someone had told to get rid of a child, gave the baby to him. Now that is much harder to follow because your characters are parachuting in an order that doesn't correspond to the natural order of gaze from one to another. More generally, English syntax provides writers with constructions that vary the order in the string while preserving meaning. Oedipus killed Laius. Laius was killed by Oedipus. It was Laius whom Oedipus killed. It was Oedipus who killed Laius, and so on. And writers must choose the construction that introduces ideas to the reader in the order in which she can most naturally absorb them. Well, this brings us back to the original question of why is the passive so common in bad writing, given that there are some circumstances in which it's the better choice. Well, it's because good writers narrate a story that are advanced by protagonists who make things happen. Bad writers work backwards from their own knowledge, writing down ideas in the order in which they occur to them. They know how the story turned out, so they begin with the outcome, and then they throw in the cause as an afterthought, and indeed, the passive voice makes that all too easy. Okay, part three, why do writers fall into that trap? Why is it so hard for writers to use language to convey ideas effectively? My favorite explanation is a psychological phenomenon that has been called the curse of knowledge. The inability that we all have to imagine what it's like for someone else not to know something that you do know. Psychologists also call it mind blindness, egocentrism, and hindsight bias. The classic illustration is an experiment taught to every psychology student. A child comes into the lab. The experimenter hands the boy, a 3-year-old boy, an M&M's box. He opens it, and he's surprised to find ribbons inside. So you stuff the ribbons back into the box, close it back up, put it back on the table. Now he watches as a second boy comes in, call him Jason, and you say to the first boy, what does Jason think is in the box? And the boy says, ribbons, even though Jason has no way of knowing that the box contains ribbons. He's just walked into the room for the first time. And in fact, if you say to the boy, what did you think was in the box when you came into the room? And the child will say, ribbons. Now that he knows what the box contains, he can no longer entertain the original mental state in which he did not know what was in the box, or the mental state of a naive third party. Now, we adults grow out of this, this limitation, a bit, because many studies have shown that adults, too, are apt to project their own knowledge onto everyone else. If you give students a list of words and you ask them which words are likely to be in the vocabulary of your fellow students, they will guess that the ones that they know are the ones that other students will know. Ditto with factual knowledge. If you have people who vary in their familiarity with a gadget, such as a cell phone, and you ask them to estimate how long it will take someone else to learn how to use the cell phone, the more adept you are at using it, the less time you think it will take other people to learn to use it, because it just seems so obvious to you. I believe that the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque writing. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that the readers haven't learned the jargon, don't know the intermediate steps that to the writer seem too obvious to mention. They can't visualize a scene that in the writer's mind's eye is as clear as day. And so the writer doesn't bother to explain the jargon or to spell out the logic or to supply the concrete details that allow the scene to be visualized. Just to give you an example, here is a passage of prose from a review article in a journal called Trends in Cognitive Science that is meant to be read by a wide audience of cognitive scientists, such as myself. I read it, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And here's the passage. It's from an article on consciousness. The slow and integrative nature of conscious perception is confirmed behaviorally by observations such as the rabbit illusion and its variants, where the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived is influenced by post-stimulus events arising several hundreds of milliseconds after the original stimulus. Well, the writers clearly expected that every reader would know what the rabbit illusion is, but I've been in this business nearly 40 years, and I'd never heard of it. So nor was it clear what the rest of the passage meant, what a stimulus was, what does the way in which a stimulus is perceived means, and so on. So I did a bit of digging, went to my books on my shelf, and I found that there is such a thing called the cutaneous rabbit illusion that works as follows. If someone closes their eyes, then someone else taps them 3 times on the wrist, 3 times on the elbow, 3 times on the shoulder, it feels like a series of taps running up the length of your arm, kind of like a hopping rabbit. The significance is where you perceive the early taps depends on the later taps, so consciousness doesn't simply track events in real time, but it kind of retrospectively edits them, so the way in which you perceive the tap on the elbow affects where you perceive the tap on the wrist. Well, that's kind of interesting, but why didn't they just say that instead of stimulus this and post-stimulus that? It would have taken no more words, and it would have been more scientific rather than less scientific, because now a reader has a way of evaluating the argument. Does that really show that conscious perception is slow and integrative, or might there be some alternative explanation? The dangers of the curse of knowledge, for me, are best illustrated by an old joke where a man walks into the dining room of one of the old Catskills resorts, and he sees a bunch of retired Borscht Belt comedians sitting around a table. So he joins them and listens to what's going on. And one of the old-timers says, 37, and everyone else erupts in uproarious laughter. Another one says, 112, again, peals of guffaws. The guy can't figure out what's going on, so he asks the guy next to him, what's happening here? The guy says, well, these guys have been around each other so long that they all know the same jokes. So to save time, they've given each joke a number. And now, when they want to tell a joke, all they have to do is recite the number. The guy says, that's ingenious. Let me try it. So he says, 121. Stony silence. 27. Again, everyone stares at him. No one laughs. So he sinks back down to a seat, and he asks the guy next to him, what happened? What did I do wrong? The guy said, oh, it's all in how you tell it. But anyway, giving jokes numbers is what all of us do all too often without realizing that others have no way of knowing what they refer to. Well, how do you exercise the curse of knowledge? The traditional solution is to always keep in mind the reader over your shoulder. Remember who you are writing for. Well, this is good as far as it goes, but it doesn't go terribly far because psychologists have shown that we're actually not terribly good at guessing other people's knowledge, even when we try. None of us is blessed with the gift of clairvoyance, and people are often overconfident in their ability to divine the mental states of other individuals. But still, it's a start, so for what it's worth, hey, I'm talking to you. Your readers know much less than you think they do, and unless you try very hard to imagine what you know that they don't know, you are guaranteed to confuse them. But a better way to deal with the curse of knowledge is to actually get a real, live other person, show them a draft, and see if they can follow it. All too often, one will discover That's what's obvious to you is not obvious to anyone else. You can also show a draft to yourself after some time has passed and it's no longer familiar. If you're like me, you will find yourself saying, that doesn't follow. What did I mean by that? And all too often, who wrote this crap? Most advice on writing should be interpreted not as advice on how to write, but as advice on how to revise, something that you can only realize once you have enough distance from the prose to recognize your own curse of knowledge, and then to apply all of your cognitive efforts on improving the clarity of the prose itself. Finally, how should we think about correct usage? The issue of language that probably draws more attention than all other writing issues put together. Now, some usages are clearly wrong. When Cookie Monster says, "me want cookie," the error is so obvious that it's the basis of the humor that even a preschool child can appreciate. Similarly, "ICANN has cheeseburger." If we did not recognize that that was a grammatical error, there would be nothing funny, to the extent that there is anything funny, about lolcats and similar internet memes. Is our children learning? This is so obvious a grammatical error that even President George W. Bush, in a self-deprecating speech, called attention to it as an error in making fun of himself. There are other usages, though, or alleged usage errors that are not so clear. And just to be bipartisan, in 1992, Bill Clinton, while running for president, had as one of his taglines, "Give Al Gore and I a chance to bring America back." The despised "between you and I" error, which language purists pointed out at the time as a damning sign of his linguistic ineptitude. Another Democratic president, Barack Obama, recently said, "No American should live under a cloud of suspicion just because of what they look like." The supposed singular they error in which the plural pronoun they has a singular antecedent, no American. To boldly go where no man has gone before, the infamous split infinitive. You think you lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday. It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. The preposition at the end of the sentence. And then the urbane, suave, sophisticated talk show host from the 1970s, Dick Cavett, in a recent article for the New York Times describing what it's like to go to his college reunion, said, "Checking into the hotel, it was nice to see a few of my old classmates in the lobby." Any of you spot the grammatical error in that one? It is the dangling participle, for those of you who went to school in the 1960s or earlier. Well, the contested issues like this have given rise to what journalists sometimes call the language war, allegedly between the prescriptivists and the descriptivists. According to this construction, on one side there are people who prescribe how other people ought to speak and write. Their credo might be summarized as follows: rules of usage are objectively correct. To obey them is to uphold standards of excellence. To flout them is to dumb down literate culture, degrade the language, and hasten the decline of civilization. On the other side are the descriptivists, who describe how people do speak and write. Their credo might be that rules of usage are the secret handshake of the ruling class, and the people should be liberated to write however they please. Well, if this was a genuine debate, and I suspect it is not, then the prescriptivists should be said that the Beatles' lyrics should have been, "It's you of whom she's thinking," and the descriptivists should insist that there is nothing wrong with "ICANN has cheeseburger." Well, this doesn't seem to be a productive way to analyze problems of usage. And indeed, I think that this is a false dichotomy. We need a better way of thinking about usage. Well, what are rules of usage? What does it mean to say that ICANN has cheeseburger is a grammatical error, or for that matter, give Al Gore and I a chance to bring America back. These rules, whatever they are not an objective fact about the physical world that a scientist could go out and observe with some instrument. Nor are they theorems of logic that a logician could prove. Many people believe that rules of usage are stipulated by a governing body, such as the editors of dictionaries, and I can speak with some authority here to say that this is not true. I'm the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary, and when I joined, the first question I asked of the dictionary's editors was, how do you guys decide what goes in the dictionary? And the answer was, we pay attention to the way people use words. That is, when it comes to English, there's no one in charge. The lunatics are running the asylum. So what then are rules of usage, given that they are not objective facts about the world, logical truths, or stipulated by a governing authority? You can think of them as tacit evolving conventions. A convention is a way of doing things that has no inherent advantages other than the fact that everyone else has agreed to abide by them as well. An obvious example is paper currency. Why does a green rectangular piece of paper have value? It's because everyone else thinks that it has value. Why do we drive on the right? Not because there's anything superior about the right as opposed to the left, but there are very good reasons to drive on the same side that everyone else is driving on, whichever side it happens to be. There's a joke about a man commuting to work who gets a cell phone call from his wife. She warns him, honey, I've been listening to the radio. You should be very careful. There's a maniac on the highway. He's driving in the wrong direction on the expressway. And he says, one maniac. There are hundreds of them. And the conventions of usage are tacit. That is, they are not legislated by a governing body, say like the Rules Committee of Major League Baseball, but they emerge as a rough consensus within a virtual community of careful writers without any explicit deliberation, agreement, or legislation. And it's an evolving convention in that that consensus may change over time. So, should writers follow the rules? And the answer is, it depends. Some rules simply extend the logic of everyday grammar to more complicated cases. Why do we say that "is our children learning" is grammatically incorrect? Well, it is equivalent to "our children is learning," and everyone agrees that "our children is learning" is grammatically incorrect. Similarly, the impact of the cuts have not been felt yet. There, it's a little harder to spot the error, but when you simply take out the intervening phrase "of the cuts," you get "the impact have not been felt yet," and again it pops out as an error. The writer was misled by the adjacent noun "cuts," which is plural, into using a plural verb, whereas in fact the subject of the sentence is "impact," a few words upstream, which is singular. When you get rid of that intervening phrase, then the violation pops out at you. Now you all recognize the notorious green wiggly line of Microsoft's grammar checker. Probably most of the green wiggly lines that you will discover in your drafts consist of errors of number agreement that you may fail to have spot because the sentence is inverted or a few words get in between, but we can all agree that these really are errors and they really should be avoided. Also, there are some prescriptive rules that make important semantic distinctions, namely, if you are addressing a literate readership, they may have different interpretation than the one that you had in mind. For example, the word fulsome is not a fancy synonym for the word full. If you were to thank someone for the fulsome letter that they sent you, you would not be praising them, you would not be praising yourself, because fulsome does not mean full, it means insincere or excessively and insincerely flattering. Likewise, simplistic is not a fancy schmancy way of saying simple. Simplistic means overly or naively simple. Fortuitous, in the expectation of most literate readers, is not another way of saying fortunate. And if someone is meritorious, I advise you not to call them meretricious. If you're not sure why, look it up in a dictionary. In general, English does not tolerate synonyms that share the same root but vary in their suffixes, and so one should resist the temptation to try to sound posh on the cheap by using a hoity-toity version of a familiar word. If you do, you might elicit the reaction that Vizzini did in The Princess Bride when he kept using the word inconceivable to refer to things that just happened. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. On the other hand, not every grammatical pet peeve or bit of folklore or dimly remembered lesson from Miss Thistlebottom's classroom is a legitimate rule of usage. Many of the alleged rules, in fact, violate grammatical logic, are routinely flouted by the best writers, and have always been flouted by the best writers. An excellent example being singular they. In a recent rant in a conservative magazine, one language grump argued that singular they was an innovation brought on by radical feminists, and that we should all try to insert a gender-neutral monstrosity into the English language, and that we should ignore these radical feminists and instead go back to the pure crystalline language of Jane Austen. Well, a scholar named Henry Churchyard, in an article called "Everyone Loves Their Jane Austen," actually went back to the crystalline prose of Jane Austen and found that she used singular they no fewer than 87 times. So what's a writer to do? How should a careful writer distinguish legitimate rules of usage from the bogus ones? Well, the answer is unbelievably simple. Look them up. Look them up in a modern dictionary or style guide. Many sticklers and snoots and pedants and peevers assume that any rule that they remember will be backed up by the major dictionaries and style manuals, whereas in fact, these reference books, which do pay close attention to English as it's actually used by competent writers, are the most adamant debunkers of grammatical nonsense. If you look up split infinitive in the Merriam-Webster Unabridged, for example, here is what you will find. It's all right to split an infinitive in the interest of clarity. Since clarity is the usual reason for splitting, this advice means merely that you can split them whenever you want to. And you'll get similar advice from the American Heritage Dictionary, the Encarta World English Dictionary, the Random House Dictionary, and so on. Modern dictionaries and style manuals do not, in fact, ban split infinitives, singular they, prepositions at the end of sentences, and so on. They represent the difference between reasoned evidence-based usage advice versus kind of smarty-pants one-upmanship. Also, correct usage should be kept in perspective, though I think it is well worth keeping in mind correct and incorrect usage. It's the least important part of good writing. You can obey every rule that has ever been bruited, and you can still be a wretched writer. It is far less important than classic style, overcoming the curse of knowledge, to say nothing of factual diligence and keeping ideas and arguments coherent. Also, even the most irksome errors are not signs of the decline of the language. And this is best captured by an XKCD cartoon by the now best-selling author Randall Munroe, in which he has a ghost visiting a language purist and says, the ghost says, "I bring a cautionary vision of things to come. This is the future. And this is the future if you give up the fight over the word literally." That is, they are exactly the same. So to sum up, I think that modern linguistics and cognitive science provide better ways of enhancing our prose, a model of prose communication, namely classic style in which language is a window onto the world, an understanding of the way language works, in particular, the way that it must convert a web of thoughts into a linear string of words, a diagnosis of why good prose is so hard to write, namely the curse of knowledge, and a way to make sense of rules of correct usage as tacit evolving conventions. Thank you very much. Any interrogatory verbalizations? Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you have a question, please step up to the microphone so that you can be heard on the recording and in the remote offices. I do apologize, we won't have a time for many questions, maybe 2 or 3, just because we had, you cannot have too much of a good thing. I enjoyed myself, even though we went over time a little bit. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I have a question. I've always been interested in how you have all these curious examples, not just in this presentation, but also in your books. And I'm curious how you index them. Do you keep them in your head, or you search for them specifically for a particular case?
Both. So I have for many years, actually for decades, literally. I have, in the old days of paper, I used to read with the scissors, and when I'd come across an interesting example or a joke, I would cut it out, circle it, put it in a couple of files. Now I can cut and paste or save digitally. For examples of bad prose, I have the huge advantage of being an academic. So I swim in the stuff. That was the easy part. And then there are some sites that I took advantage of. It turns out there's a Pinterest site in which a woman just collected every cartoon or sticker or T-shirt she could find that was about grammar. And so that was a rich source of kind of grammatical humor that I could plunder. And as I was writing the book, I especially kept an eye open for examples that would illuminate a point. So a bit of everything.
I see, thanks.
Hi there, thanks for the great talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Just a small thing I wanted to say first, but you reminded me that 15 years ago, when I was shopping for a dictionary in a bookstore, I actually was digging through the dictionaries and rejecting all the ones that had incentivize in there as a word, because it's not a word, but I guess it is, because people use it.
It is, yes, in fact, it is a word.
Darn it. And also figuratively versus literally actually has been misused for a really long time. There's like a lot of history on that. But but I was wondering, you kept talking about language, and I kept wondering, well, you're talking about language, but you're talking about English. Have you explored anything with other linguists about problems like this that are similar in other either Latin-based languages or not Latin-based languages?
I imagine that much of the advice would carry over. We all comprehend things using the same brains, and the advantage of allowing your reader to visualize something as opposed to just spooning out cliches surely holds in every language. And indeed, classic style, which is the kind of the central image from which a lot of these bits of advice are theorems or implications, according to Thomas and Turner, was actually invented by the great French essayists of the 17th century. And even though French style is in many ways different from English style, they credit writers like Descartes and La Rochefoucauld with coming up with this conceit of pretending that you're describing a world. All the differences between the French language and English language clearly did not matter. There are, to be sure, there must be some differences, especially when it comes to the way in which the linearization of words in syntax conveys a tangled web of ideas, because there are some obvious cross-linguistic differences. In German, for example, the verb comes at the end of the sentence instead of the beginning. And so the tips on how to engage the reader's mind in real time would have to be modified accordingly. I'll find out when this book is translated into other languages, how many questions I get and how the translator will deal with them. As far as the words, new words like incentivize go, incentivize actually turns out to be a pretty useful word because there's no, remember, one of the guidelines for writing is omit needless words. And if you say something like lay out incentives for, that's an awful lot of needless words. Moreover, when you compress a phrase into a verb, it adds a semantic difference, namely that it implies that there is something that you are directly and immediately causing. And as we become more aware that policy changes that may have been thought up and implemented to achieve some abstract goal may have perverse results, because as soon as they lay out the incentives, people will follow the incentives, perhaps doing something the opposite of what the writers of legislation intend. The verb incentivize reminds you that in doing something, you are automatically changing the landscape of options. And so it conveys an additional meaning above and beyond creating incentives for.
Right, it makes it active. It makes it a
It's
little
much,
more
exactly, it's active, it's
Yeah.
direct, it's causal.
as opposed to providing incentives,
Exactly.
which does sound kind of passive, yeah.
Which sounds,
I've gotten over it. It was 15 years ago, so
well, yes.
I'm over it
and
now.
indeed, so in fact, so what you are going through, and probably many people in this room have gone through in our own lifetimes, is what E.B. White never went through in the transition from to contact as a neologism to a part of everyday English. And so this happens, whether or not you're convinced by my arguments that incentivize is a useful word, it doesn't matter what we think. If people use it, it becomes entrenched in the language. Yes, the dictionary writers will include it. They have no choice. They're selling a product that has to be useful. What does useful mean? You write according to the way that your readers will expect words to be used. What we do in the American Heritage Dictionary is that because it's not, generally when you look up something up in a dictionary, you don't care about how any old person on the street uses language. You have in mind a kind of virtual audience of readers who care about language, who expect the writer to take care in their choice of words. And so we assembled a sample of called the Usage Panel of about 200 journalists, linguists, sports writers, poets, novelists, kind of a sample of people who just have shown they care about words. And we poll them, we ask them, what do you think of incentivize? And their decisions will determine what goes into the dictionary. And in cases where it's like too close to 50-50, there'll be a usage note that just explains the history of the word, explains the current reaction, and the writer can then make an informed decision.
I went through my dictionary and put Post-it notes on all my favorite usage notes.
Oh, very good, yes.
Like to be graduated from college as opposed to graduating from college.
That's an excellent example, because there, again, the language is changing. There
Yeah.
are purists who would say it has to be graduated from college, but that's not the way people talk anymore.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for your question.
I apologize. I'm afraid we'll have two more questions, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, thanks for coming. It's so great to have you here. I studied you a long time ago in a linguistics course at UCLA. On the subject of usage and things becoming popular convention, and pet peeves, I don't know how much you're exposed to what I call corporate ease, but I think this group knows that people have started using verbs as nouns or nouns as verbs, like top asks, our top asks in the meeting, or our
Top
learnings,
ask? Yeah.
asks, yeah, plural.
The ask,
It's
yes.
very, very irritating. Or the learnings that we got from the trip, or to architect something, make it a verb. I want to know if this bothers you as much as it does me, and if you might consider making a PSA demanding that this be abolished.
Yes. Well, yeah, no, I can't do it. I'll tell you why. One of them is,
right?
yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. Okay. And I have a Dilbert cartoon where the boss with the pointy hair asks one of his employees, I'd like to task you with a deliverable. Yeah. And she completely freaks out. My world is falling apart. Task is not a verb. A couple of observations. One is it's not new. This has been going on probably for many number of centuries, probably at least since the Middle English period, or at least early modern English. Again, the reason that Strunk and White had a problem with to contact is that contact for them was only a noun, and it was turned into a verb. Now, I mean, I don't know, do any of you have a problem with contact? I don't have a problem with to contact. And in fact, if you were to go through any passage of prose, you would find probably about a fifth of the verbs started out life as nouns. We notice the new ones, but it's a process that's been going on for a long, long time. It's one of the things that makes English English. And you often forget how many verbs from nouns there are: to chair a meeting, to table the motion, to pen your memoir, to hand me the cookies, to foot the bill. It's only the new ones that get under our skin. It's not that it's inherent to the English language that verbing a noun leads to a monstrosity. Then there's but I agree, there's a lot of corporate prose that is annoying, especially when it's unnecessary. But there are ones that will earn a foothold in the language because, as with incentivize, they not only capture a meaning while omitting needless words, but they add the extra meaning that this is now a conventional, direct, and causal process. And that's why task started to creep in. Who knows whether it will last or be a kind of a fad word like some of the ones from the Mad Men era. But there's nothing we can do about it. Some new verbs will come from nouns and vice versa.
I'll try to get over it.
Yes.
Last
Maybe you should
question.
say the Serenity Prayer, accept the changes that you can't do anything about.
So you mentioned literally a couple times and how horrifying it can be. And there's also some other words like that have evolved to be used the opposite of what they mean, like peruse. People use to mean scanned quickly when it means to pore over in detail.
Yes, peruse.
And I'm all for the evolution of language, but it seems like not really productive to have words evolve to mean the opposite of what they mean.
Yes.
And I was wondering what you think about that.
Right. Well, there is a category sometimes called contronyms or autoantonyms, things like to dust, which can either mean to put dust on, as in crop dusting, or to take dust away, as in a duster, to sanction, to table. Often, what happens is that a word will start off and then have various near synonyms that have slightly different meanings, and then one meaning will give rise to another until they kind of meet and have senses that are the direct opposite. It doesn't happen all that often, and usually these things are clear in context. The vast majority of words have more than one meaning. You just flip open a dictionary to any word, and it's meaning one, meaning two, meaning three. And generally, they are distinguished by context. They can survive side by side. So, say the word literate can mean either actually capable of reading, or it could mean sophisticated. Conservative can mean on the right of the American political spectrum or resistant to change. And so you can have a conservative liberal, and it's not an oxymoron. So word meanings can coexist. In terms of doing something about it, I quote the famous exchange between Margaret Fuller, who once wrote, "I accept the universe," and Thomas Carlyle, who said, "Gad, she'd better." Language change is going to happen, and there's almost nothing that one can do about it. It doesn't mean that language degenerates or deteriorates, though, because often the sloppy meaning that we dislike can survive side by side with the precise meaning that we do like. And it's interesting to go back in the history of usage and find that the same issues that annoy people today were annoying people a century ago. So if you're one of those who, like me, likes the word disinterested to mean without a vested interest, as opposed to being a synonym for bored, and you worry if people use disinterested to mean bored, we're going to lose that lovely word disinterested meaning unbiased or without a vested interest. But people have been using disinterested to mean bored for centuries, and we still have the more precise meaning of without a vested interest in. So language change does not imply language degeneration. Often the more precise word is available, and literally is another example. A lot of people use it to mean as a kind of an intensifier, a bit of hyperbole, but there's still cases in which you use literally to mean literally, and it's clear in context that that's the way you're using it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pinker. It's been a joy.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.